What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another episode here of the Somewhat Sports Podcast. The people are hearing my voice first. You all already know what that means. It means that, unfortunately, here on SS, our fearless leader, the captain of our ship, Chris, is not hosting things today, which, tends to be a 50-50 shot whenever it comes to me having to host things, so we'll see how it goes. But another thing, which I think this is only the second time this has happened in pod history, Dame is not with us today either, so both Chris and Dame are not on this episode, in part for a myriad of reasons, because, ladies and gentlemen, this is the long-awaited, the much ballyhooed episode, as Chris has been one to mention over the last couple of weeks. This is the hockey episode of the show, ladies and gentlemen, and with it being the hockey episode, Chris and Dame, love them. They would even admit it. Hockey ain't the strongest suit, but do not fret. This is not a solo episode. I wouldn't do that to you people, trust me. Joining me is a man who I've done many a podcast with recently. This is a man who I've talked hockey with. This is a man that knows his stuff about hockey. He also knows plenty about football too, and he knows to cause just a bit of chaos. We're going to tighten up the ship, and he's going to help me set sail on this because, this man knows something about setting sail when it comes to pirates. Joining me on this episode, the Podfather of all podcasts, Rick. How are we doing, Rick?
Jurg, I'm going to take the Patriots over the Cowboys on a 4-point upset. Wait, you said hockey?
Yeah.
All right, let's get weird.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, let's get weird. This is good. I'm doing good. It's nice to talk a little bit stuff other than football here. I know those fans who know us, we talk about a whole litany of things. Somewhat Sports is going to delve into the Harry Potter edition at some point very soon because that's what we do also. Rest in peace, Michael Gambon, by the way. Yes. And I'm thrilled to be chatting about another sport that I love. And like the shirt says, let's get dangerous.
So on this audio only podcast specifically, Rick is wearing a "Let's Get Dangerous" shirt on him that has, of course.
Oh wait, this is audio only. Oh, yeah, that's unfortunate. It takes me back to the radio days, back when I was, too ugly for TV. So there you go. Works out for me.
I'm right there with you. But yes, ladies and gentlemen, if by any chance you've ever listened to other podcasts I've been on, first, why are you listening to me this much if you're not related to me? And second, you very much know the reference that Rick was making right there. Of course, me and Rick do a weekly NFL podcast with a third member of our crew, who the Somewhat Sports people I've seen a couple times on the last few mock drafts, Justin, the master of games himself, Zucker. So, hey, it's just the two of us this week. Hopefully Justin doesn't get jealous, although he's been on twice. So in theory, he's had his lion's share on the show. But now, Rick, it's you and me. It's you and me doing the thing when it comes to hockey. So as they sound the one SNL skit, let's do that hockey. But no, in all seriousness, ladies and gentlemen, this is kind of going to be a very interesting episode, to say the least. For one, we are recording this. I'm going to guess this is 10 to 14 days before it gets eventually posted. I'm willing to bet that it's going to be posted towards maybe it might be day of actually, but I'm going to say maybe the day before the NHL season really gets kicking off in terms of the first couple of games of the season. But I like to think this will be an evergreen episode. Rick and I, on this edition, we are just going to do a very quick recap of the big moves that happened in free agency and, well, not just free agency, but the offseason as a whole, because this was a summer of trades, Rick, to say the very least. I think, the NHL offseasons have been unique. All sports really have been unique ever since the pandemic. I think this has been the most active NHL offseason we've had since the pandemic happened, since post-2020, and what an offseason it was.
Yeah, a lot of guys made some significant moves. Some key players from some Stanley Cup champions of the past have switched allegiances. And obviously one of the big things that we talked about, you and I talked about off air today, a team that was a Stanley Cup contender and probably still is at some point is, they're down a very important man. So it'll be interesting to see if they try and make a trade or go on the free agency wire to reclaim some of that. So, because there are names that are out there too that have not been signed as of yet. So, the offseason's still going on, even though there's preseason games going on. And one note here, Mark Stone could go to hell.
So as Rick takes a shot at Mark Stone, anyone familiar with Rick knows that he is very much not scared to take some shots here and there when necessary. As Rick is mentioning there, we are going to talk about the more current news towards the end, because we're going to end this episode off kind of very briefly going through the idea of what we are expecting the divisions to be. Not a full breakdown of all these teams, because let's also be real, we're fans of two teams, Rick, that probably don't really deserve all that much breakdown. going into this season.
No.
I'm a Blackhawk fan. Rick is a Ducks fan, so no individual analysis necessarily. But a brief I say encapsulating of what these divisions will be like, because I think we're in store. I mean, Vegas winning the cup itself is crazy because this is a team that debuted less than basically a half decade ago, 6 years ago, and they accomplished their goal. Chaos in the NHL this time, which, I mean, Rick, this is perfect for us. This is our kind of show. This is our kind of league.
No.
So.
But not only Vegas, Seattle had a really good run in the postseason in their second year ever. So, and the Devils have looked really good, the young, really, really good. So, listen, there are teams that are rising up from the ranks from odd places. And that's, if you're a fan of the sport, you love it because, for one thing, it's great to get new markets out there. And for two, Canada still hasn't hosted the Stanley Cup in 32 years. So it works out.
So speaking of teams rising, let's talk about teams that tried to use free agency here really quick to get the best of what was available in this free agency class. I kind of talked about this going into what was NHL free agency on the pod. Now, this was a while back on the Somewhat Sports podcast, so people will have to go through the archives, which we wouldn't mind if you do. Somewhat Sports is the way to find us on YouTube and Spotify. But really, this, I think, Rick, and you most likely agree here, is this was a free agency class of good players, not a lot of great players. There were top 4 defensemen in this class. There were good, solid top 6 players here, maybe closer to your second line, more so than very much your top line. Top 6 to middle 6 forwards really made up the bulk of this free agency. And going into it, there was a lot of questions of who's going to get paid here, especially because, looking forward in the NHL, the salary cap spikes that are coming over the next few seasons. It's projected we're going to get a $4 million increase, I think, going into the 2024 offseason. And then the summer of 2025 has been the big summer that the NHL has been waiting for. Finally, this freaking sport is going to go over $90+ million for the salary cap, for the hard cap. Oh my in heaven, it's been way too long for that. The pandemic certainly did not help.
They have to be the last team that sport to do that, right? Of the big 4. So
absolutely.
I think bull riding's even done it before hockey has.
F1 has a bigger budget cap.
Yeah, I know.
Right. So that
calm
just
down there, Max Verstappen.
He never will. But no. So let's go over we're going to quickly go over, ladies and gentlemen, the biggest names that got signed to the biggest deals. Got to make sense. And big names kind of in quotes because, big for this free agency class, maybe not necessarily for certain other free agency classes that we've seen in previous years. The first 2 names I'm going to quickly go over here, Rick. Actually, I might just go a couple here at a time. Let's start with a couple teams in the Eastern Conference mainly that made a good chunk of moves. With the Pittsburgh Penguins, Kyle Dubas going over this offseason, new general manager and, basically vice president of hockey operations for the Penguins. He was not trigger happy. He was not trigger shy, to say the very least. He went pretty quickly in free agency within the first 24 to 48 hours, re-signing Tristan Jarry to a 5-year deal worth just a couple hairs under $27 million, and went over $27 million to get a defenseman in Ryan Graves on a 6-year deal worth $27 million total. Clearly, the message was clear in Pittsburgh when they fired the previous regime of Hextall and Burke, was that there's still a focus to contend with Sidney Crosby, with Malkin, with Letang, and Kyle Dubas certainly got that message right away with these signings. Plus, Noel Acciari, just to briefly mention him, good bottom 6 piece that they added there. They were not, of course, the only team overall, but especially I think the Eastern Conference teams here, Rick, really had a lion's share of what the activity was this offseason, because I also look at a team like the Detroit Red Wings. They were very active in free agency this year, just like they were last year, and the key to it was, funny enough, you could almost compare it to the Andrew Kopp signing that they made last season, because they added JT Compher from the Colorado Avalanche for a 5-year deal worth $25.5 million as well to plug in, we assume, very much into the second line. What his role will be, who knows? Maybe, ironically enough, maybe him and Kopp will be playing next to each other. You don't know. We don't actually know what the lineups will look like going into the season. But there was that. The Ottawa Senators certainly got busy. There's a signing they made that we will mention in a little bit because it has to do with it. It more connects to a trade they made. But let's talk about, I think this was one of the bigger ones, Rick, just in terms of need. The Senators season last year was fully lost, in part due to injury, but in part due to just underperformance in net. They did not get the performances that they had expected in net from their tandem going in, and they needed someone a fresh face to come in and help things. And they're really going with a new face for them, Rick. Jonas Korpisalo, 5 years, $20 million. A guy who had a amazing second half of the season with the Los Angeles Kings. Because we actually talked about this a little bit. It was dead to rights in Columbus. It was done for it looked like he was going to be struggling for a long time. But he gets that revitalization and he makes his way over to LA at the trade deadline last year. Phenomenal in the second half. I think he basically got all the starts in the series against Edmonton, if I'm not mistaken. And it was tough. Then again, Connor McDavid, very understandable that you would struggle against that guy of all people. And gets this big contract. So this will be like the first deal that we kind of go over in slightly more detail. What was your reaction, Rick, when this happened to the Senators be very willing to spend money here to get Korpisalo?
Well, you're right. I mean, Ottawa last year needed a better tandem in net for them to really compete. And this is a team that, we're waiting on to really be a much better team than they have been in the past. I mean, you look at who they had last year. Brady Tkachuk was one of their top young guys, and that was a big key for them. But they also had really good role players too. DeBrincat and Jurg were two nice veteran presences for them on those lines there. But it really was being held up by the fact that Cam Talbot was good, but Cam Talbot can be better than that. And they used, I think it was somewhere between 6 or 7 goalies at some point throughout the course of the season. I think they even called the Zamboni guy to be the goalie at some point for them. So you just know that when you have that kind of an issue there, that you really need to address that position and get somebody else in here who you can really rely on. And look, you're right. Korpisalo was mired in the muck in Columbus for a while there. I mean, listen, Columbus has had their fair share of issues and their fair share of problems when it came to a lot of their, goalies. I mean, we talk about, guys like on the team, like Merslins, and other guys that are there for them in net. But Korpisalo was really the stud coming out for the Kings. And to get him on the deal they got him on, I think it's a good move for them. It's not a massive deal for a goalie of his caliber. $520, $4 million a year. I think, he's still got time to prove that, his time in LA wasn't a fluke, because this is a guy who's, only 13 wins above 500 in his career, but, a goals against average of just over 3 and a save percentage of just over 900 is, you want those numbers to be a hair better here and there in the NHL. But listen, if Ottawa can keep him, around with good defense, and they have very good defenders on their squad, I think they'll be a sleeper contender, because I think Korpisalo could get on a run where we've seen guys like him, like younger guys like him, really surprise a lot of people. I think back to Jordan Bennington when he came out was a big surprise. I think back to Connor Hellebuck, who was a big surprise for Winnipeg too. So there's always a guy somewhere that's a diamond in the rough, and Ottawa took the chance on Korpisalo. There are, like I said, there are veteran names that are out there that I think, if you're a casual hockey fan, a Corey Schneider or a John Quick, but Korpisalo could be a name that you need to know in the future. So I like it for Ottawa. I do.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, 5 years for 20 overall, so an AAV of $4 million. That's pretty good. And the standard for goaltending has very much changed in the league the last 2 to 3 seasons because of the offensive outbursts we've had. Like you mentioned, if he just gives them slightly above average, that's all they need on this team, because they had way below average last season. It was a struggle for them. Like you mentioned, with Cam Talbot no longer on the team, and then Anton Forsberg, who people had high expectations of. I always saw him more as a backup, and I think now that Korpisalo's there, I think that they have a firm 1-2. They understand who is the starter on that team, and I think that's probably a big thing, because while we've seen it work in instances, you need to have a grip on who is the number one goalie on the team. And Korpisalo, to me, this makes it very clear. And you mentioned with the defensive core, Thomas Chabot, one of the alternate captains, as your top defenseman, and then Jacob Chychrun, who they acquired via trade back at the deadline of last season. This is an Ottawa team that's it's new ownership that they got this offseason. It's, some faces had to be moved around, changed. This could be a big thing for Ottawa. They had expectations last season. Those expectations are still very much high going into this season. They believe, based off of the shifting in their division, that they can make a big step. And hey, if you're Ottawa, if you're that fan base, you want that, because, oh my God, it's been just torture for them ever since that Eastern Conference Finals run years ago.
Yeah, and you mentioned the young guys that they have. Chabot is 26 and Chychrun's 25. Well, I'm also a guy who likes veteran presence here, and I got to tell you something. The fact that they also re-signed Travis Hamonic to a 2-year, $2.2 million deal at the end of the last season was big for him, because he had, I think, his best season in years. I mean, last year he had 75 games, 21 points. He was a star for them. He did what they needed to do. Ottawa needed a good defenseman to really kind of lead these younger guys. And Hamonic being that old grizzled veteran, which is amazing to me because, I went to college at Hofstra University, and we did Islanders games back when I was on the radio station there. And Hamonic was a rookie back then. And that was 2011, and now we're talking 2023, and he's a 30-something-year-old veteran defenseman who's seen everything. This guy played for the Brandon Wheat Kings and the Bridgeport Sound Tigers. That's how far he goes back,
Very much so. And it just goes to show that in hockey, some guys last a long time because they start really young. Travis Hamonic was one of these guys. He started his career pretty early. I think even earlier than I thought, but that's just how impressive he was, especially physically. I think the value he has in Ottawa is ultimately the physical presence that he provides, because I think teams, as we start to see things continue to shift in the NHL, I think one thing that teams are starting to slowly bring back is a guy that's willing to literally just be on the roster to throw the body. Travis Hamonic is going to throw all 220, 230 pounds of himself. He's going to body check the life out of some guys on the ice. So that is big value for Ottawa. And again, a season that we'll talk about the divisions later on, like they believe they can compete for a wild card spot much more so than what last season was. But we'll get to that in detail in a little bit. In terms of the other big signings that occurred just throughout the league here, again, this was a very interesting year to say the very least, because it was a matter of who's going to get AAV, who's going to sign long-term, who's going to sign short-term, whose market is going to be rich, like Korpisalo, versus guys who maybe they just quote-unquote settle, but in reality, they feel the time is a year or two away. One of these guys that I think is a big mention of that, we could maybe go into more details later on for him, is Tyler Bertuzzi, who signed a 1-year, $5.5 million contract with Toronto, a team that, general manager change. There was, I don't think fear is the proper word, but there was talk going into the offseason of what is this core going to look like? It's been all about the core four in Toronto. Even I think casual watchers of the sport have heard all about the core four in Toronto. That has been the, basically crux of what the roster construction of that team for years. And the core did not get broken up. They just reset things. New general manager as well, with Brad Scher living there, who escaped the Daryl Sutter reign of terror in Calgary, who then eventually got fired himself. So big W, one of the few W's for Calgary in the offseason. But he signs there. That led to the leaving of certain other guys in Toronto. From Toronto, ultimately in free agency. Michael Bunting signed a 3-year, $13.5 million contract with the Carolina Hurricanes. Ryan O'Reilly signed a very interesting 4-year, $18 million contract with the Nashville Predators, a team that went through a lot of upheaval on their roster. They retained salary and traded Ryan Johansson to the Colorado Avalanche, which I was kind of shocked that they retained 50% of his salary, to say the very least. And then they just straight out bought out Matt Duchene, which that was probably the biggest shocker of them all. I really found it difficult to think, like, even back then, it's like, you couldn't find someone for Duchene. But I think part of it was maybe they put themselves in a bad spot when it came to the idea of retaining salaries. Because for new listeners, for listeners who don't really know too much about the NHL rules, when it comes to trading players, you're allowed to retain salary on 3 players at a time. So you can have 3 active players that are on your books via salary retention. And Johansson was the second of those 3 slots for them. The first one was Matthias Ekholm back at the trade deadline with the Edmonton Oilers. And it was a very minuscule amount that they even retained on Ekholm. I don't even think they retained $1 million on him nearly. I think it was only $600K. Had to happen for the deal, but really makes you wonder if Nashville is kicking themselves now very much so in the pants because of what's happened since then. So that was an interesting signing, to say the very least. And I think, Rick, the last one, to just wrap up all the big names here, because we're going to get into more trades and winners and losers here in a moment. Dmitry Orlov. I think for the most part, people were saying he was the top guy in this class overall, regardless of position. A good defenseman who's won a Stanley Cup in his career, has decent offensive output for himself. He's got a couple 30-point seasons. He's a good player. The Bruins traded for him this past year to help make a run. He played really well for them in the playoffs. Both him and Bertuzzi played really good. Gets a 2-year, $15.5 million contract from the Carolina Hurricanes. Cashes out in a pretty good way. What were any responses, Rick, to those specific signings that were kind of like, I think those guys were like the cream of the crop in terms of O'Reilly, Bunting, Bertuzzi, and Orlov, and they all got pretty handsomely paid.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you have to wait and see on Tyler Bertuzzi a little bit, only because there's been some history with him the past couple of years. Obviously, he had that back surgery back in 2021, so he missed the majority of that year, and he came back this past year, and he did all right for himself. I mean, he played 58 games, so you're hoping that he's able to be back and be in full force of that, which I think is why it's only a 1 year, $5.5 million deal. But look, Toronto needs all the help they can get. This is the team that got John Tavares, which us Long Islanders know is not somebody we speak about very politely here, and I'm refraining from spitting in the brass spittoon that's next to me because it's for another podcast for another day. But at the same time, if you're Toronto, you have to try and make the best of what you got, and I think they'll be okay. I mean, I think they'll be another competitive team once again. So I think for them, it's a case where you have that roster built up pretty nicely. Obviously, along with Bertuzzi and along with Tavares, you have your goalies in Samsonov and Jones, who I think are a pretty decent tandem for them. And you just hope, if you're Toronto, that you can parlay that into something else. One name you didn't mention that I do want to kind of bring up is Ryan Graves. Because talk about playing your way into a massive deal. This is a 28-year-old kid who played 2 full seasons back-to-back with New Jersey and parlayed that into a 6-year, $27 million deal with the Penguins. When you play well, you get paid well. That's just how it is. And that's what you meant with Dmitry Orlov, too. When you're the top guy, you get paid top guy money. And, actually, he's not top money because the Islanders, for some reason, threw, $94.5 million or whatever it was, 24.5, but still the same thing. At Scott Mayfield.
It might feel like 94.5 at the end of his deal.
It does. Scott Mayfield's getting his own wing in UBS Arena for all we know. But 7 years for him and 7 years for Pierre Engvall. Now, look, I don't hate Pierre Engvall. I think he's a very good player, but this reeks of Alexei Yashin and Ryan Smith all over again for them. Right. They're taking a long-term deal on guys who may be good and may be problematic. So the Islanders got to figure that out really quickly. But look, I don't know if there were any other major surprises that I saw. I mean, the only one that I know of is from my team, but I also don't really know how I feel about it. I'll be dead honest with you.
Are you talking about Killorn or Gudas?
Killorn. I don't know how I feel about it because yes, Trevor Zegras is great, and they re-signed Troy Terry to that big deal. Killorn is 34, and I don't know if it really fits the vibe in Anaheim. I just hope he plays better than Leo Carlson, man. I am so down on that number 2 pick, and I'm talking hockey. I can talk about it. I am so down on that pick. Screw you for getting Connor Bedard for your team. I wanted him so badly. And then I settled for Fantilli, and they didn't even do that right. Come on, Pat Verbeek.
It's one of those things where very quickly when it came to the draft, any other year, Adam Fantilli going first overall, very much happy. Just the fact that he's coming out the same year as Connor Bedard is just unfortunate for him because Lord knows, any other year, this would have been the Fantilli draft. But this year in particular, it became – and the idea was it's like, hey, Fantilli there – Fantilli is the number 1 center. Easily is the number 1 center if in this league in the future. And it was a shock to say the very least when Anaheim decides to go Carlson to go on the Killorn contract here really quick. Because like you kind of said, we've really gone through all the big individual signings that have happened. So I think we can kind of table those for maybe a little bit later in terms of when we bring up winners and losers here in a bit after the trades. But I think when it came to Killorn, it's a very similar thing to what happened with some of Chicago's signings as well, whether it be the Corey Perry deal, the Nick Foligno deal, or a trade that happened, I think it was pre-draft if I'm not mistaken, the Taylor Hall trade with the Bruins to help alleviate them for some cap flexibility on their end. It's these teams realize that they're going to be rough for a while. So you bring in guys to kind of help cultivate the environment that is there for these young guys to continue to build. And I think another thing, the popular term that I was hearing this entire summer was the idea of weaponizing the cap. Because, well, it's funny to say the word weaponize when it comes to something as arbitrary as salary cap. It is one of those things where it's like, how do you use your current cap situation in your favor? And it can be leveraged in the future. And I think while Killorn, it was certainly a steep price for AAV. I think the way that Anaheim looks at it is that 2 years from now, when they've gotten what they can from him, when he's still a solid enough player, they can retain salary and trade him to a playoff team 2.5 seasons from now. I think with Chicago, well, Foligno and Perry were just 1-year deals, but maybe Taylor Hall a year from now, if Hall looks good next to Connor Bedard, they can ship him off for some draft capital and an asset in, it wouldn't be 2024. It would be the 2024, 2025 season at that trade deadline. I think the idea is that teams tried to weaponize the cap. Teams in our funny enough, we're talking about our teams here, Rick, in terms of the Blackhawks and the Ducks, where you had other teams that you mentioned the Graves contract with the Penguins, a deal that I was a big fan of. I don't understand why some people were down on it, because Ryan Graves has proven that he can be a good defenseman on good teams. This Devils team last year was good. A couple seasons ago, before he got traded from the Colorado Avalanche, he had like a plus 35. Like, this guy's proven you put him next to weapons, he can fill a role. And now he's going to be next to Sidney Crosby and Chris Letang and Evgeny Malkin. Or maybe he'll be next to Erik Karlsson. We call that a transition, Biscuits. So let's move on from a couple signings here, Rick, over to the trades, because I think the thing with this offseason was that while free agency was decent, there were a couple long-term deals. I was actually looking at the list earlier, Rick. I think only, if I'm not mistaken, just in terms of like AAV for contracts, I think there were only 14 or 15 contracts that got signed this past offseason that were above, I think I was looking at 4.5, 5 million, at least something in that range. And only a third of them were like multi-year deals, or above 3-year deals. So a lot of guys settled for short-term deals this offseason, which makes for names moving, yes, but not the thrill of it. The real thrill came from the trades. So there were 3 big trades that really were at the forefront of this offseason. And a couple guys that let's be real here. Actually, we all figured during the season, all 3 of these guys were going to get dealt at some point. Let's start with the first of the 3 trades that happened here really quick, just in terms of the details, and then we'll go through all 3 after. The Los Angeles Kings and the Winnipeg Jets. Oh, they went to wheeling and a dealing. The Los Angeles Kings got themselves a new number 1 center, maybe, or he's at worst number 2 in that lineup, depending on if Anze Kopitar still is the top guy. They got him from the Winnipeg Jets in exchange for Alex Iafallo, Rasmus Kupari, Gabe Vilardi, and a 2024 second-round pick that was sent over to Winnipeg. Los Angeles quickly made Pierre-Luc Dubois a happy and rich man with a 8-year, $68 million contract extension that also included a no-move clause. I don't know if the first year of that no-move clause is this season in particular, but it is in the contract in and of itself. So that was the first of the 3 big deals. Pierre-Luc Dubois, backstory, guy who's already been dealt previously in his career, started in Columbus, got traded to Winnipeg, was unhappy in Columbus, and it was quickly realized last offseason that this dude was not long for Winnipeg. He did not want to be a Winnipeg Jet for that too long of a time. The popular destination was Montreal, and it was basically said without being, actually, no, let's be real here. It was basically said that he was tabbed to be a Montreal Canadian. Even at the 2022 draft, he was at the draft because he thought the trade to Montreal was happening at last year's draft. Not this year, last year's draft. So it just really goes to show what he thought was going to happen back then. But he went through another season in Winnipeg and eventually got paid. It was an interesting situation, to say the very least. And a lot of people were saying, oh, Winnipeg, you're going to lose this guy for not much. You don't really have any leverage. He's going to be gone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They get back 3 roster players and a second-round pick for a guy that everyone thought was just going to be gone for pennies on the dollar. Not the worst possible return you could ask for a guy. And LA ends up paying him, which they're happy. Dubois, we assume he's happy. Winnipeg is happy. And I don't think Montreal is really losing too much sleep because that's a pretty talented young team.
Well, Montreal's just generally unhappy. So, I mean, that's where it goes there. No, I think you're right. This deal, you forget that Pierre-Luc Dubois was the number 3 overall pick in 2016, because you think about the drafts and you only really are concerned with who's number 1 or who's number 2 for the most part. But this is a guy who was picked behind Austin Matthews and Patrick Lane, who, correct me if I'm wrong, he was traded for Patrick Lane in the COVID season, right?
Yeah, it was it's the funniest thing. They were traded for one another.
Right. So it's weird to think about all that, but he's a solid player, and yeah, he will become the new number 1 center in LA. I don't care if Anze Kopitar is out there, on a hover round, wheeling around the ice. He's old. Clear the way for Dubois being the number 1 guy, and for Winnipeg. Winnipeg got 3 very solid players, a couple of young guys in Kupari and Vilardi, and then Alex Iafallo, I think he just needs another chance. He's a very solid player, but he's got to crack 20 goals at some point this season. He's close. Last time he cracked 20, he was playing for Minnesota Duluth. So, but in his seasons in the NHL, he's got 85. So he's a goal scorer. He just needs an opportunity. I think you get that with Winnipeg, because I think he'll find himself on that front line pretty good for them. And again, Rasmus Kupari's a solid young player in this league. Probably needs a little more seasoning, so probably split time between the AHL affiliate and top tier. And then Gabe Vilardi, we'll see. I mean, again, these young guys could not pan out, but it gives you depth in Winnipeg, and I think that's a big key for them.
Which I think if you are Winnipeg, that's more than what you could have asked for. And I think with Velarde and Iafallo, you have two definitive guys who are going to make the roster. Kupari, like you said, I feel like with Kupari, and I think it's still kind of the case in LA, they kind of had a logjam when it comes to the center core, especially. Like Kupari, I don't think over the next year will be the last guy traded from LA, especially that's a center, because they have a lot of other guys. Not all of them uber talented per se, like not all of them will be a top 6 center, but they still have a lot of centers in that farm system that could stand to be potentially dealt here. Achille Thomas has seen time at center. Tyler Madden, although I think he's probably more of a winger now in his youth career. A guy who, well, he's not going to be in the NHL. He's going to be in the NHL this season, but where in the lineup is he going to stand? Quentin Byfield is a guy, you talk about former top picks, Rick, you're talking about another guy there. I think he's second overall pick in his respective draft a couple of years ago, and just has dealt with so much in his career, in part because the pandemic impacted the development cycle for him. Really inconsistency because he can't go back to playing the juniors because juniors was basically canceled for nearly a full season. Couldn't go to the AHL. The AHL was canceled for a very significant amount of time. Like a lot of these young guys were put in a really bad spot because of COVID. And I think we're only just now beginning the recovery of these guys' developmental curves. I think you're seeing around the league a lot of guys that were drafted from 2019, maybe 2018, but definitively from 2019 to I think 2022. A lot of those guys were severely impacted by the pandemic in terms of where they got to play. And I think Quentin Byfield is going to be one of these guys in LA here. You got Jose Kopitar, you got Philip Deneau, and you got Pierre-Luc Dubois. Aside from all their names being, very fun to say, those are all three pretty good players that he could take different aspects from. The defensive game of Kopitar, the strong leadership capabilities of Philip Deneau, and Pierre-Luc Dubois has natural talent. There is no denying the natural talent that he has. You have a former second overall pick learning from those three guys. I would be salivating if I'm a Kings fan.
But you mentioned the logjam too. There are 9 centers on this roster, eight if you don't count the injured Blake Lizotte. But Kopitar and Trevor Lewis are 36 each, and Philippe Deneau is 30. So, the youth movement is coming. It's right there. And if the Kings are smart, they'll bring those guys to the forefront because you want to see what the kids can do. You learned that, in baseball too. You want to see what the kids can do because the kids could end up being really, really good. So I think that movement is just around the bend, and Dubois is going to be the catalyst and leader of that, I think, in LA.
Absolutely. And, another guy who we're waiting on eventually, I think he's probably going to end up playing more winger than he was center compared to his national development team career. But Alex Turcotte is going to be a guy that should be seeing time. I would hope this season, again, another one of these guys that got completely screwed over by the pandemic and what happened with his development and where he could and could not play for significant stretches of time. Just very intriguing things happening for LA in a Pacific division that home to the now defending Stanley Cup champion. There's some real fire. Home of the defending Stanley Cup champions, one team, and then on another team, you have 4 MVP awards between the top 2 centers on the Edmonton Oilers.
Yeah.
That is not an easy division to live in.
No, it's not. It's interesting. That's why we love it so much because you have these really good teams that pop up and these really good players that just make their impact. And so, again, if you're the Kings had their run. Back in the 2010s they had their run, and now this is what you have. You're building up for the next run in the 2030s. So basically.
Or maybe the 2020s. Maybe they'll try to compete. You never know. Let's stay in the Pacific Division, Rick. But we're not going to be talking about a good team necessarily. We're going to be talking about a team that had to make a trade, per se. They definitely made multiple trades, but we're talking about the trade that they had to make. The Norris Trophy winner from last season, Erik Karlsson, he eclipsed 100 points. What an offensive season the guy put out there. Just goes to show that there's still something left in the carcass that everyone thought was him after all. And look what happens when he can actually play games and be relatively healthy. Still pretty good on the offensive end. But the Sharks as a whole were a tire fire, to say the very least. Not good in any way, shape, or form. So they sought this entire summer with general manager Mike Grier, I believe, who's the brother, I think, of Chris Grier of the Miami Dolphins. So a little fun stuff. General managing just runs in that family, I guess.
It does.
The big thing for him in his tenure was what was he going to trade Erik Karlsson for? And, I think really, was he going to be able to trade him? And then what was he going to get back? And he traded him. What he got back? It could have been better. Let's go through the trade briefly. It ended up being a 3-team deal because the Montreal Canadiens helped out in terms of taking salary, not in terms of retaining anything from Karlsson. No, they're not that dumb. But what they did do is they took salary from Pittsburgh. This was a pure maneuvering of salary between the Penguins, the Sharks, and the Canadiens to make this work. Ultimately, with the goal of Karlsson being moved, with San Jose not retaining as much. Because at the end of the day, I think this was more an ownership thing for Grier personally, that the goal was to not retain that much salary on Erik Karlsson. I think the cap they were going to go to probably at most would have been $2.5 million per year, maybe 3 million. I think they were easing up on that towards the beginning of the offseason, that they could have been willing for 3 million if the situation persisted, but they only had to retain $1.5 million of his $11.5 million AAV for the next 4 seasons as he goes to Pittsburgh as the main piece in this deal. They were able to get a 3rd-round pick, though, so there's that as well. And they did get a depth player in Rem Pitlick over to the Montreal Canadiens. The Pittsburgh Penguins sent Jeff Petrie, who then Montreal subsequently traded to Detroit, and then Casey DeSmith, who I think also got traded recently, if I'm not mistaken. So poor guys, they just kept getting. But Montreal did get a 2nd-round pick in 2025 for the help of making this happen. And then to the San Jose Sharks, I think, Montreal did their thing. They just got a 2nd-round pick, which I think is all they kind of wanted at the end of this. It is really between Pittsburgh and San Jose what happened. And for San Jose, they got from Montreal the contract of Mike Hoffman, which there's that. And then they also got Mikael Granlund, Jan Ruda from the Pittsburgh Penguins, and a conditional 2024 first-round pick and the condition is pretty simple. Thank God, because there have been some weird conditions over the last couple of years, Rick. This is just a top 10 protection. Straightforward to the point. I appreciate that, Pittsburgh. I really do. When it comes to this, Rick, obviously it was known that Erik Karlsson was going to get dealt, and he got dealt. And lo and behold, Kyle Dubas. I mentioned him towards the start of us talking about this. He was not trigger shy whatsoever. I think from the beginning of the free agency period, the thought was that Pittsburgh was going to be a player in some way, shape, or form this offseason for a trade to happen. And as you finally started, not even just trade, maybe important move in general, and then as you start to see all the dominoes fall, because the NHL is especially a reactive sport, because some of the last couple of free agents that really need to go to certain places, Matt Dumba, I think is the number one name that comes to mind, were all being held up by this deal. And it got done. Erik Karlsson going to the Pittsburgh Penguins, so he is going to be a part of the core, a new core 4 for Kyle Dubas, just older, but they've won, so there's that. But it's Sidney Crosby, it's Evgeny Malkin, it's Chris Letang, and now it is Erik Karlsson joining Ryan Graves, as we mentioned earlier, and Tristan Jarry on the contract extension. I think we could definitely say a lot about Pittsburgh here. Of course, it makes sense that they want to compete and they want to try to give themselves the best chance to win one more time with Sid and Malkin, and getting a defenseman who had 100 points last season helps. But I think a interesting portion, and you obviously can talk about this, what were your thoughts on the return for San Jose overall? It was tough because it was the combination of you knew Karlsson had to be dealt. Yeah. And we also knew from ownership there was a limit to how much they were willing to retain in a transaction. So it's a lot of complexities when it comes to the discussion. But overall, 3 roster players and a first-round pick go over to San Jose. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, I think this is really cleaning house for San Jose, and I think what it does is it kind of resets them and resets their expectations on what this season's going to be. Because, of the guys that they got, I would say Mike Hoffman's the only really bigger name, and this is a guy who had a 36-goal season, back in 2018-19 with the Panthers, but and his best years might be behind him, but you even want to look at their free agency moves that they made, this season to who they picked up. They got Kyle Burrows from the Canucks on a 3-year deal, a decent defenseman, not great, but nothing to write home about, but not a bad player. Ryan Carpenter's on their team too, and that's a rookie. That's not a rookie, but like a younger player who's, dealing with a lot of. He basically was in a lot of jam with the Rangers at a time. So now he was in Hartford for a good 50 games last season. So he's now got a shot to kind of have staying power. And then other guys that they had, Giovanni Smith, and Scott Sabourin. I mean, it's basically you wave the white flag because this is a guy who you knew you could get assets for, and the assets they got, like you said, Granlund, Hoffman, and Ruda are what they are. They're okay. I mean, but again, you have to go into this knowing that you're not going to be as competitive this season as you hope to be, but you also know it's okay. Look, they're in a really tough division. They've got a decent head coach, I'll say. I mean, David Quinn, he had his problems in New York, but this is a guy who's a good leader of young men and of young talent. He's shown that in the college ranks as well. So, I think Mike Greer played the youth card and played the card that said we could either try and hold on to Karlsson after this 100-point season or trade him with the value that he has now because, hey, he just scored over 100 points. Put him on a team, get some youth back, And, it wasn't going to work as a 2-team deal, so they had to include Montreal in there as well. But the haul they got back, if I was grading this trade for San Jose, I would probably give it a B-, because I think you had to do it, and you got back decent enough picks, plus that conditional. So if you're San Jose, you might have two high first rounders this year coming up. Maybe. You never know. I mean,
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing for a team that, like you said, is in a division where you got who do you got? You got Vegas there, obviously.
Edmonton, LA, who we just talked about.
LA, we just talked about them. Yeah, and the Kraken are now there too, and they're really good. And Vancouver is always a tough out. Notice I'm not mentioning the Ducks for obvious reasons. And I mean, they're not going to compete this season, but if they can build a good enough young core, they might have a chance in the coming years, I think.
And I think something that I'm not saying this obviously never happened before a recent period of time. Obviously, this was a thing that I'm sure you look back at trades of years gone by, it's happened. But the idea now is very much more of a popular thing that the players you get back in a trade like this are now your trade chips as well. And you mentioned it between Mike Hoffman, Jan Ruda, and Mikael Granlund. Within the next 2 trade deadlines, all 3 of them are going to be gone. And all 3 of them are going to be gone for draft picks. Jan Ruda is a defenseman who I want to say 2 years left at a salary cap hit of under $3 million. Guaranteed he's being traded at the deadline, especially with some of the trades that have happened the last few years. What's his name? Jeremy Lauzon, I think, got traded for a second-round pick. Jan Ruda could be dealt for a first. Sounds weird to say, but it's a realistic thing. It is the valuation of blue liners in the NHL today that leads to that. Mike Hoffman also, like you mentioned, if he's on pace for 25 goals this next season, I could see him being dealt as well, and Mikael Granlund as well. Just as of now, it's only their own first-round pick plus this conditional pick from Pittsburgh. There's very much more depth picks that could be added to this team, plus the young guys that are already coming along. I believe, I haven't seen necessarily confirmed, but I would be shocked if William Eklund doesn't make the Sharks roster.
Oh, yeah.
Towards the beginning. Like, he is their former top 10 pick from recent years, and I think, like, this is going to be his first big breakout into the NHL playing along. And there's still a piece or two that could be traded on the Sharks team over the next year or two, because is Tomas Hertl really going to want to stay on a team that only gets, like, 25 to 30 wins? That's going to be a legitimate question to wonder. So I think if you're San Jose, was this individual trade, did you get the most back that you probably could have thought? Probably not. But when you eventually expand upon it, and we can do a trade tree of this 3-4 years down the line, what did you turn Hoffman into? What did you turn Granlund into? What did you turn Jan Ruda into? I think it's a significant thing with that.
Not to mention, like I said, the other guys they got in free agency. They also got Anthony Duclair, who's been bounced around a lot of different teams, but he's still got some youth in him at 28. So, what could you get for him possibly if he's a trade chip at the deadline? You could probably get a nicer pick here or there as well. So I think like we were saying, for the Sharks, it's all about just looking ahead.
Exactly. And, biding your time, and Duclair was just on a pretty good team. He was on the Stanley Cup finalist Florida Panthers. So it goes to show a good team will probably want him if the need comes about and if he plays well. Really quick here about the Penguins, Rick, before we move on to the last of the 3 big trades here that headline this offseason. Them getting Erik Karlsson, obviously it's a big deal. It makes it very clear what Lemieux and the ownership group as a whole wanted, which is to try to compete one more time in the Sidney Crosby era. Karlsson, obviously we know the defensive issues, but they did get Ryan Graves that we mentioned earlier. He can very much slide in alongside Karlsson and be his line mate and help on the defensive end. We know Erik Karlsson will never see the ice if it's penalty kill. Let's just say that. And then he's going to be their power play specialist, driving play on 5-on-5. What do you make of the Penguins getting Karlsson to try to do something over the next 2 to 3 seasons, which is honestly probably all that's left in this core at this point?
Well, again, look at who's been dominating the past couple of years when it comes to the Eastern Conference. It's been the Washingtons of the world, the Tampas, the Floridas over this past year. Carolina's been a really dominant team. I think this move, like you said, signals that this is the last chance saloon for these Penguins to get one more cup win. Because it's not only the guys you mentioned, it's not only Crosby, Malkin, Jeff Carter's on this team still. How he's still standing at some point is beyond me. But he's 38. He's there. Malkin's 37. Letang and Crosby are 36. Lars Eller's 34. This is it. The Penguins are making one last run at it. And, they have other guys that are on this team who I think, youth-wise can be really good. But, you hope that these younger guys can just learn from this older crew. And I think, if you're the Penguins, this is the move you had to make. You had to put somebody on there so that, your defensive line could be, like you said, Graves and Carlson, or Letang and Xavier Ouellet, or Ryan Shea, Marcus Patterson are also really good defensemen there for them too. So they've got good enough depth, but this was just the guy they needed to have on there number one for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is, Kyle Dubas is the general manager to have helping with things here, because he is a guy that obviously for years now has been, the GM of a very competitive team with the Toronto Maple Leafs, a team that's used to making the playoffs. And now you have a team here in Pittsburgh that is similar thing. Their playoff streak only just ended last season, and it was only by, I think, a game or two. So you have a very successful organization used to success, and that is going to be the expectation. This is the kind of move, again, the second Dubas agreed to go to Pittsburgh, you knew something like this was happening within the first calendar year of his tenure. There was no way a trade like this wasn't happening with Kyle Dubas there, because he knew what the order would be from on high, and he's more than willing to do it. He made a couple decent deals in his time in Toronto that, it helped them finally win a playoff series. Ryan O'Reilly, anybody. So there was very much that, to say the very least. All right, let's go to the final of these trades that happened. This trade also helped with a signing that occurred in free agency, and it might help with a signing that occurs in the future going into the season, but we'll get on that momentarily. Alex DeBrincat of the Ottawa Senators, he was traded to Ottawa last season at the 2022 NHL draft from my Chicago Blackhawks, went to Ottawa. Ottawa paid a pretty penny. Can't get my English together, can I, Rick? They paid a pretty penny, to say the very least, for his services. A second-round pick in the 2022 draft and a third-round pick in the 2024 draft is what Ottawa paid to get DeBrincat. And he was fine, but he wasn't special. He didn't necessarily produce the way that they had hoped. Still put together a good season. I think he was at 26 goals, maybe 27 goals, a bit of a tick down from the 40 goals seasons that he had previously within his career. So it was tough sledding, to say the very least there. And it just became clear during the season that DeBrincat, they tried to make it work, and I think DeBrincat gave it a shot, but at the end he just didn't want to stay in Ottawa. So it took him a little bit of time to find a partner, but they did. And it was with the Detroit Red Wings who helped with this trade. And in terms of getting stuff back, interesting return, to say the very least, for the Ottawa Senators. Getting back in the DeBrincat deal, they got Dominic Kubalik, a former Blackhawk, so just former Blackhawks players going all around in these trades. Donovan Sabringo, who's just a AHL player. Maybe he cracks the roster at some point. It's not a guarantee. A 2024 fourth-round pick. I feel the need to mention that because the more interesting thing is the 2024 first-round pick that is conditional. And this one is more complicated with the conditions, because it kind of loops into a previous deal that Detroit had made. But I'm not going to get into that because it's way too complicated. If you want to see the full breakdown of those conditions, go to Cap Friendly, phenomenal website when it comes to your hockey roster breakdowns, cap breakdowns, and trade summaries of such. So Rick, and of course I should say Alex DeBrincat then pretty quickly signed a 4-year extension with the Detroit Red Wings. That was a big thing of where he was going to be dealt. The team had to be willing to give him a deal. It wasn't the super long-term deal that some people thought he was going to get, but it was a 4-year deal worth just shy of $32 million, $31.5 million, right on the money, literally. So when it comes to this deal, Rick, your thoughts? You're surprised when it was the Red Wings that won the DeBrincat sweepstakes after all.
Interesting on both sides of it, because, what have the Red Wings been over the last few years? They've been a team that's really been lackluster at best, because they've been trying to get younger and trying to find their 90s edge all over again. And Alex DeBrincat's a good player. I think he's going to be a guy who can probably help them bridge that gap. Can he help guys like Dylan Larkin out? I think so. Just by being present for that team. Again, like you said, the haul for Ottawa, they got what they got, and that's really all they really could hope to get in the trade there. So, it takes us back to the first segment that we talked about with Ottawa, with how they're going to be a team that you think can be a sleeper for a wild card, but in order to do that, you have to get rid of somebody like a DeBrincat, who you hope bigger and better things. But this haul for Ottawa is pretty good. I think like you said, you got what you got for it. The prospect's all right. The conditional pick is what it is. And the forward they got, Kubalik, I think his name. You said that's his name, right? He's because some of these names are just like Kubalik. I'll tell you something. They change all the time in college sports, so the pronunciation's always flip. He's a good young player too. I think he's gonna be a solid addition for them. And so, I think for both sides won on this trade. Detroit got a player that can help them out, and Ottawa got depth and picks. The Red Wings are in a tough spot because they're competing in a very tough conference. I think Detroit wishes they were back in the Western Conference at times, because they might They might win the Northwest Division, at some points, but now they're stuck in the Eastern, and they're tough sledding for them. But this trade will help them out and will help the growth and maturation of their young stars that are there. And again, it adds to a really good haul they had, because it's not only DeBrincat, they also added, JT Compher in free agency too, and Gossespa here. So, they have good players. This is a nice little addition for them. And DeBrincat's only 25, so he's got plenty of time. Wearing a number in the 90s with old Steve Yzerman as your GM there. So, if anybody knows how to do it, he does.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned it, just youth all around when it comes to Detroit. Moritz Seider, who's going to be doing a contract here soon, going to be one of the best defensemen for a very long time in this league. You add DeBrincat, who you mentioned, just 25, already potted home 2 40-goal seasons for himself. So this is a guy who's proven success. And, I kind of allude to the fact that maybe this will lead to another transaction here in the future for Detroit, because I'll be real with you, I think Patrick Kane is going to become a Detroit Red Wing here. He has that connection and chemistry with Alex DeBrincat. DeBrincat can vouch for him. Steve Yzerman, I think he'd be able to make it work with Patrick Kane. I think they could find a way to make it work with Patrick Kane. And, it's one of those things that it just, like, DeBrincat's best seasons were with Patrick Kane as his teammate, as his line mate, basically. So do you get a guy there to maybe help get your freshly signed, newly traded for a winger going? I could very much see that being a case for Detroit willing to do it. Waiting for a bit, because Kaner did get some offseason surgery, is very much waiting on things, but is making good progress. And, when he is close to fully healthy, I think the Red Wings are going to make that signing. And they'll probably hold off on playing him for at least like a couple of weeks after they get him, just to make sure he is fully that. But, this is all part of the quote-unquote Yzer plan, as they've been calling it in Detroit for a couple of years now. And, I mean, you talk about the tough division they're in, Rick. The expectation, again, like we were talking about with Ottawa, which, they get Kubalik back, who I could say this as a Blackhawk fan who's seen him pot home 30 goals in the season. He could surprise you. I don't know if he'll get 30 again, but he could maybe get 15 for you, maybe 20. Yeah. But I think for Detroit, they're they want to be in the same boat as Ottawa, where they want to take that next step this season. And I think it's a big question on if they're going to do it, because I still, at least for me, I still think there's something missing with the Red Wings that just slightly keeps them out of being confidently in the playoff picture. I don't know what it is necessarily, because you mentioned Ghost as well as a 1-year signing for them, which was a pretty good signing. It was 1-year deals galore for some of the defensemen, aside from Orlov, who got the 2 years. It was a year for Gostisbehere, a year for Klingberg in Toronto, a year for Dumba in Arizona, or poor guy. But, it was a year for a lot of these defensemen. You have him there with Seider on that end. You hope that Ben Sherratt can be decent at best. And then you have an offensive core that you're hoping is able to perform this season. So if you're Detroit, it's a lot of hope. And it's going to take a lot of that to really help you in the East this season. Before we get to the divisions here really quick, we kind of talked about winners and losers. We've kind of given our thoughts on a lot of the transactions here. So in quick terms, Rick, we could talk about some of the winners and losers that we've had throughout free agency. Yeah. I mean, we talked about the free agency moves they made. I think it's very much easily so. The Carolina Hurricanes are winners in this offseason.
Oh, yeah.
Added Michael Bunting on a 3-year deal, which he's going to grow as a player, not necessarily in terms of point production, because he was a decent point producer in Toronto, but I'm talking about learning all the finer points of things, like how to deal with officials, because Michael Bunting very much went into NHL's doghouse at the end of last season. I think he's going to learn in that Carolina Hurricanes environment how and what to do with things, especially with Rod Brindamore as his head coach. That's going to be great. And you got Dmitry Orlov, who joins Jacob Slavin, who joins Brady Shea, Brett Pesce, and Brent Burns in the defensive core. Now, unfortunately for them, they added the scumbag Tony DeAngelo, but they also did add an actual, good upstanding player in Caleb Jones as well. So, you even it out.
Yeah, even it out. Listen, I mean, I think that for the Hurricanes as well, you saw what happened once they lost Svechnikov in March. When he went down, this was a different team. I mean, they still made their run in the conference finals and everything, but the fact that they added those pieces and are going to get him back, this is a squad that's extremely dangerous once again. And, I think you have to really look at this team heavily as a favorite to get out of the Eastern Conference again. Sebastian Aho is still there, and they've got Jordan Stahl still as their main guy, their captain. But this is a squad. You mentioned all the moves they made. Bunting, is a huge player, huge signing for them. And former guy like Freddie Anderson is their netminder. So, they're a good team. They're a good team.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very solid team. And, it's just we've seen them now make it to the conference finals a few times over the last, 5 seasons or so, but they got swept again. And I think that's the big sticking point for the Hurricanes is that what can they do to finally win a game in the conference finals and then finally win the East again? It's been a long while. It has been a very long while for them. So if you're Carolina, you wait with bated breath. But I mean, in theory, you've made the moves. Let's talk about a team that they didn't face them on this playoff run. They faced them in a previous year playoff run. The Boston Bruins, Rick, really quick. Your thoughts on their offseason, just between winners and losers, like the highlights of their offseason. We haven't really talked about them because they couldn't really do a lot in free agency because they were so cap-strapped, even with some of the trades that they made. But, they went all in. They lost in the first round. And you saw what happens is that, eventually you make the all-in push, and it doesn't always work out that way. Not every team that goes all in will get the cup at the end. And you saw that Patrice Bergeron leaves, retires. David Krejci retires again in his career. You lose Bertuzzi in free agency. You lose Orlov in free agency, which was honestly expected when it came to those two. Taylor Hall had to be dealt for a cap dump. And I think they did a decent job at filling in the holes here and there with a couple decent names. You got Morgan Geekie and James Van Riemsdyk as two guys that could kind of help fill in things in terms of being strong bottom six players. And then defensively, you had Kevin Shattenkirk, the veteran. I think he's probably just going to be helping run the second power play unit. But this Boston Bruins team, do you categorize them as a winner or a loser in this offseason, Rick?
They were going to be a loser regardless, no matter who they added, because it's not really about the numbers for me. It's more about the heart and soul of what they lost with Patrice Bergeron and David Krejci. I mean, these were guys that were mainstays in that Boston lineup. And I think they tried to soften the blow a little bit. They brought back Milan Lucic on a 1-year deal, which, I think is more about bringing back a guy who the fans love than anything else. I don't know if he's going to have that big production at 35 that they're expecting. Like he's not going to be Zdeno Chara playing into his 40s, everyone loves Big Z. But I mean, they did what they could to bring in guys on short-term deals because they knew they weren't going to go swing for the fences and add the big guys that required longer-term, more money deals. But you're right, they are a cap-shop team. What I will say about them, though, is that, I mean, they still have a good core from last year's incredible regular season, but there's a reason why they only handed out the President's Trophy in the regular season and not the Stanley Cup. And that's because they couldn't get the job done. Yeah. So regression's more than likely for this team, I think, but they'll still be a competitor in what's a very tough division.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think people are hoping for a fall off for the Boston Bruins. And will they break the points record again? Probably not.
No.
But they're still going to be a competitive team. Boston, that Atlantic division as a whole is going to be a very physically fought division, to say the very least, with some of the names and faces that you got around there. So I named two specific teams there in terms of winners and losers. Any other teams maybe that we talked about, Rick, or is there a team that maybe we haven't really touched upon any of their moves so far that you think deserves the monarchy of winner or loser?
Well, I mean, I think we talked about Tampa Bay a little bit for like their maker deals, but the fact that they had to trade Ross Colton to Colorado also is a big problem for them. Like they're another squad that I think, they were going into this season like trying to manage what they had. I really like John Cooper as a head coach. I think he's a very, very solid mind back there. But the thing that happened with them too that I know is an issue is that a lot of these teams just passed them by because they got faster and they got younger. I mean, you're talking about you don't talk about Crosby and Letang and all those guys in Pittsburgh being older. Well, Stamkos is 33 and Victor Hedman's 32 and Kucherov is 30. So they're starting to get a little up there in age and maybe they're getting a little slower too. So I don't know. I mean, this is a team that still has Braden Point, but it's a lot of questions I think for Tampa Bay. So I would categorize them as a loser. And I think another team that I would probably, I mean, Pittsburgh is hit or miss. Like there are some articles that I've seen that have categorized them as a loser this offseason. I think I can understand that, but Tristan Jarry, they had to bring him back. He looked pretty good. And I understand that, some people wanted Connor Hellebuck or John Gibson, but trust me, you don't want John Gibson, number one. And number two, you were not going to get Hellebuck for the money that I think he's worth. So pass on that. But I will say, we talked about it, and I didn't really discuss it. If you believe that Brian O'Reilly from Matt Duchene is a one-on-one trade-off, I think you have to give the Predators a little bit extra credit here. But do you believe that is the question?
Yeah, that's the thing. I found it just more weird. Now, part of it is, there's a change of general managership. Barry Trotz is now the general manager, he's only the second GM in franchise history, because it was David Poyle who ran things for a very long time. Masterclass of a GM, by the way. He very much deserved all the congratulations he got at the draft. Just didn't need to be all 32 dang teams that did it at every single pick. But, that's neither here nor there. But I think, I understood the Duchesne trade. I understood the Johansson trade. That was more than expected. I think the shock with Duchesne, it's not that he necessarily was taken off the team. It was just that he got bought out. Like, to me, I'm like I know the cap hit was high, but I'm like, hey, there's a guy who just a season ago, not this past season, but the one before, 40 goals. Like, this is a player who showed he still has something, and he ends up going to Dallas, a team we didn't really talk about because I think that was their main move. But I mean, sometimes consistency is all you need. Like, I would argue, even though they didn't really do a lot, I think Dallas deserves to be considered a winner in this free agency because they did just minor things. They believe in the roster they have. They made a pretty good run last season. They got overwhelmed ultimately in the conference finals. But this is a team that has the cup aspirations. And you look at Colorado, who, you mentioned them making the Ross Colton deal. They also had to trade away Alex Newhook over to the Montreal Canadiens, which gave them one of the picks that they then used to get a Ross Colton. It's very much an interesting thing. To me, the way I look at things before we will talk about the divisions here just the next couple of minutes, but I think the Pacific is closer to knowing who the definitive top two teams are. I think most people would say it's between Vegas and Edmonton are 1 and 2 in the Pacific. I think the Central is just slightly more wide open. Not like a big gap. I don't mean to say that anyone in that division could make it because, the Blackhawks and Coyotes exist there. They're not making it. But in terms of like the top teams, like minor things happen. Nashville, to me, I find it weird to say that team that got Ryan O'Reilly could be considered a loser. But at the same time, you consider it just really weird that you move on because to me, Duchesne and Johansson being off the team would normally signal a rebuild. But they get O'Reilly, and they made at least one or two other moves, if I'm not mistaken, in free agency as well, in terms of like veteran guys. And it's just like, huh? Well, I think they got Luke Shen, actually, if I'm not mistaken. Nashville did. So you make these moves here where it's almost like, why did you get rid of O'Reilly? Why did you get rid of Duchesne? Because then you tell me, if they're walking in with Duchesne and O'Reilly as the top two center core, and then Forsberg as a support on the wing with some of these young guys like Kemmel and Tomasino, like that would have made more sense to me rather than you just straight up getting rid of Duchesne. Again, they bought him out for nothing. You can't even say they didn't even lose a trade. It's just they bought him out, and that cap hit is going to be on their books for a very, very long time. What was left on his deal, I think it was 3 or 4 years left on his deal. So that means in the NHL, when you buy a player out, the buyout years are equivalent to double whatever the remaining years were. So they got at least 6 to 8 years of buyout that they have to pay towards Matt Duchesne, which I don't typically think that putting yourself in the Minnesota Wild category is the best thing possible to do. But there's that.
There are worse categories to be in than the Minnesota Wild category.
Well, it could be the Arizona Coyotes category where you're not going to have a home here in the next few seasons.
Yeah.
Speaking of, teams that, did and did not do much. Oh, the Calgary Flames, Rick. I just got to mention them real quick because what an offseason it was.
Yeah.
In Calgary. Or do we call it an offseason that it wasn't? Because there was a thought at one point. We mentioned them earlier that their old GM is basically ousted there because he loses a power struggle. At least initially lost a power struggle to Daryl Sutter before even ownership was like, please leave. And new general manager, new head coach, a lot of similar pieces to last year. Huberdeau and Kadri are still both there. But there was a lot of talk of like, are pieces on this team going to get dealt? Elias Lindholm, who's a free agent after this season. I got to say, I'm extremely surprised that he's still there because it's like there's apparently reports that saying that he does want to sign long-term in Calgary, but they have a number in mind for him that they specifically want. And this is where you get into the complicated thing of like the player versus the team. And they've lost this battle the last couple seasons already because Johnny Gaudreau left because of this issue. Matthew Tkachuk ultimately left. I think maybe they were more willing to pay him, but he just didn't want to be there anymore. You have a situation here where guys ended up leaving Calgary in the past. And now are you kind of putting that up to risk again? I think you have a guy in Noah Hannafin who he's going to get traded, I think, ultimately. But you're telling me it couldn't have happened this offseason when it was at the very beginning of free agency, at the draft, when the cap is way much more wide open? Because at this point, none of these trades are happening. Like, we're going to have to wait until the deadline. But I really think there was a lot of missed opportunity here. And especially even the goaltending room. I'm not saying that anyone was going to take Jacob Markstrom in any way, shape, or form, especially how bad he was last season. But Dustin Wolf is looking really good on this team. Like he is a prospect that a lot of people are putting a lot of tabs in, and now he's going to be the third goalie. And I know that's kind of being the new thing now this season because, well, Lord knows what Vegas went through with all their goalie situation, but you're now forcing a guy to have to start the season in the AHL because you still have Dan Vladar. I think a lot of the quote-unquote questionable moves for Calgary was the moves they didn't make, not freeing up their roster, not trading guys that they could have got way more back for. And the few trades they made, they got like a third-round pick for Toffoli. I think that was kind of what little they decided to do. I don't think they took advantage of, and I think it could come back to bite them because honestly, Rick, it would not surprise me if at the end of the season, I think Hannafin is for sure gone, but it wouldn't surprise me if Lindholm just walks away for nothing. And you're talking about the third guy over the last couple seasons for Calgary. Well, technically second because they got something back for Tkachuk, but we saw what happened there. Like it's not a great look for the Calgary Flames right now.
Well, to be fair, too, they also just completely shot themselves in the foot by winning their first preseason game 10-0 over Vancouver. So I mean that's you think that's a great omen? It's not. No, it's really not.
It's because it's Vancouver. Let's be real.
Right. The only thing that can save them is getting a brand new arena, but that will hopefully happen. But if it does, the city will pay most of the deal, and so will the province, and the owners will skate off with $300 million only paid. So
that sounds
good
on
right. You. Yeah, good on you. So I agree, though they were very inactive, and in a conference where a lot of these teams are making other moves, inactivity is not the way to go for Calgary.
Yeah, and a team that was, again, kind of similar to Pittsburgh, like a win or two away, basically, from making the postseason last year, and you just dropped it, to say the very least. Last individual team I think we're going to talk about, Rick, before we talk overall about the standings, the Columbus Blue Jackets. Here's why I want to bring them up, and I know part of what you're going to think.
I'll let you finish, but then I got something to say about Columbus as well. So
here's why I want to bring up Columbus, because aside from the recent debacle that happened between their head coach hire and Spittin' Chicklets, which props to Paul Bissonnette and those boys, you look at the offseason that they had. They draft they get lucky at number 3 overall that Adam Fantilli is able to drop to them, but. Sorry for the dig, but realistically, the defense, they underwent a massive overhaul defensively for themselves. We're talking about some of the guys that got, we were talking about the 3 big trades. Columbus themselves were busy bees in, before the draft started, as well as LA, because LA helped facilitate one of these deals for Columbus, where Ivan Provorov gets to the Columbus Blue Jackets via a 3-team trade with the Philadelphia Flyers and the LA Kings. And Damon Severson gets traded straight up to the Columbus Blue Jackets, and he gets a very nice 8-year extension for himself. Good for the man. He was able to get it. Jarmo Kekalainen paid a pretty penny for this Columbus team to have a massive boost on the defense. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't just Jonas Korpisalo that struggled last season in that. Good Lord above, Elvis Merzlikins. I felt bad for the guy. Like, a foreign dignitary has not suffered that kind of, just air raid assault since, like, the 40s. Like,
I was going to go with Franz Ferdinand, but okay.
We're going back a little bit further than that. Yeah, but I think ultimately it was just tough times to be a Columbus Blue Jackets goalie last season. And I think for them, Jarmo Kekalainen, he went all in on the defense. Like I said, Provorov and Severson, they got Fantilli there. He's looking to be he's going to make the team, obviously. Very much like Bedard for myself and Carlson for you guys. But I want to bring them up because aside from the coaching debacle, they made moves. And it's interesting. We talk about these teams that are hoping to take that next step. Jarmo Kekalainen, to me, is a guy that I think he needs this team to take that next step because he's been a GM for a long time, and he's only had 1 playoff series win to show for it.
Yeah. So, well, look, I mean, you can get away with it, though, because it's Columbus, right? Nobody really cares. It's like Jacksonville in the NFL. Nobody really cares what Columbus does because they were relevant for a couple of different things. They were relevant because they're the team that had the unfortunate incident that made us all have the hockey netting, and in the arenas, unfortunately, back in 2003. Yeah. They're relevant because they beat Tampa Bay, in 4 straight games in that one series. They had their one shining moment, if you will. And, unfortunately, they're relevant because of what happened to Merzlikins' best buddy, the other goalie who was unfortunately killed by the firework. But other than that, nobody really cares in Columbus. The Blue Jackets are just there, honestly. And so I feel bad for guys like Boone Jenner. I feel bad for Adam Fantilli. Please come back to Anaheim. Never going to happen, but still. But look, this is a team that is there. They're going to compete, but for what? What's the end game here?
A top 10 pick.
Well, yeah, and I really feel bad for Pascal Vincent because he's now got to take the helm after the Mike Babcock debacle. Hold on for a second. I'm going to just shoot my phone over here at the wall and show some old photos of myself. Back when I had hair. Look, this is a franchise that doesn't really know how to run itself. And
that's fair.
That's the best way you can put it. I mean, they're just there.
Yeah.
Honestly, I mean, part of me wishes that Atlanta had stayed and they were the one that moved to Winnipeg. But I can't. I'll go after the city of Columbus all I want. But
I will say this: Columbus Blue Jackets fans are pretty passionate about their team. They do care.
No, they're passionate. That's great because they haven't had anything to celebrate since the Columbus Destroyers of the AFL folded back in 2008. But you got to have something to do in Columbus when it's not Ohio State football season, I guess.
Yeah, very true. Very true. I just felt it was relevant because I think the most active teams deserve at least somewhat of a spotlight, and they were pretty active for the most part.
They were active, but
it's very fair, but I feel like we'd be a lot nicer to them if the thing with Babcock hadn't just happened. Which, by the way, again, for the Somewhat Sports verse here, because not everyone that listens to us follows hockey, as far as I know. I'm willing to bet. I think the easiest way to simplify it for the people is this: the Columbus Blue Jackets, now former head coach, was basically earlier in the summer as he was meeting with players, he was asking to see their phone, to see various pictures and what they were up to, see what kind of person these guys were.
Imagine, if you will, that you went on a first date with a girl and the first thing she wanted to do was look at your phone and see all the apps that you had on your phone
or your search history
well. I was playing it nicely for the Somewhat Sports verse, since I want to be invited back here at some point, but yes.
Oh, no, you'll always be welcome back, Rick.
Okay, so then imagine what's their search history. Yes, and all the different web browsers they have. What's this one for? Why do you have 19 web browsers for apps over here? That's what it was, basically.
Yeah, so he basically just wanted to see all the players' phones, and one of the players from Columbus texted Paul Bissonnette, a former NHL player who has a very popular podcast, I think probably the most popular hockey podcast, if I'm not mistaken, called Spit and Chicklets, phenomenal show. And Paul Bissonnette just goes to air with it, and I will say this, I don't think he would have gone to air with it at all if he wasn't confident about it, and we know him. When Biz Nasty gets confident about something, he's just going to go, and it turned into a whole thing. Columbus tried to PR their way out of it, and they thought they had succeeded for a brief moment of time, getting quotes from Boone Jenner and I think Johnny Gaudreau, if I'm not mistaken, which I think the whole thing, and again, this is where it's we would need a longer episode to talk about this, which is why we won't delve too much into it. But basically, it is a head coach that has a track record of being a problem for some of his players in the past, and was now doing something that, to the veterans on the team, it's not a big deal, right? Like Boone Jenner, who got married this offseason, Johnny Gaudreau, who, a big thing when he even came to Columbus was that he wanted to be closer to his family. Should have gone to Philadelphia or New Jersey for that, but regardless, those two guys, them saying that it was no big deal. Yeah, it's not a big deal for you, but for the young guys on this team, for the 23-year-olds and younger, it is a big deal because Mike Babcock is very notorious for being extremely difficult with his younger players. Ask Mitch Marner how he feels about Mike Babcock. Ask any of the Toronto Maple Leafs core guys that were there. I don't think a lot of them would say too much nice about him. And even some veterans, Chris Chelios, Rick, Chris, and this is the funny thing, because this is where the generational gap comes in, because, a lot of people, Rick, when the Mike Babcock thing first came out, they were calling these players soft and stuff, right? Chris Chelios, do you consider him soft, Rick?
No, absolutely not.
And Chris Chelios has basically said, I don't like Mike Babcock either.
No. I mean, it's not only that. Mike Commodore is another huge critic of him, back from the Ducks farm system, because Babcock started coaching for my team back in the glory years, back when they were, one win away from being a Stanley Cup champion with the vaunted Mighty Ducks of Anaheim name.
Yeah,
I'm still bitter about they changed their ownership, changed their name and their color scheme, and that's when they won the damn Stanley Cup. Still bitter about a lot of things.
It should have been the Mighty Ducks that won it. But
should have been me.
It goes back to the Ducks tenure. In his Red Wings time, like I said, Chris Chelios, not a fan of him. Johan Franzen, Mike Babcock basically ruined and ended his NHL career, unfortunately for him. And then in Toronto, I mean, again, some people that listen to this pod may not know the story, but basically he had Mitch Marner, a then rookie on the team, list in order. Like he told Marner to put the guys in order of who he thought was the most hardworking to the least hardworking on a list of guys. And then Mike Babcock gives the list to the veterans and tells them that Marner did it. And then when they ask him about it, Marner's like, he told me to do it. He forced me to do it. And so it became a whole thing where it's like, and Marner was very emotional about it too. Like this was not a regular thing. Like when you got the veterans in your locker room pressing you about this, that's not an easy thing for a young player to have to go through. This is a guy who is notorious for not being easy to work with, notorious for putting his players in bad spots, especially younger players, which Columbus, oh my God, there's plenty of young players on this team that are making their, return. Like I should say that are coming back for like second, third season, but then you have Adam Fantilli. Like poor Adam Fantilli, he dodged a bullet, if anything, in terms of having Mike Babcock. Just that may have saved his career early on here.
We talk in our universe about the Urban Meyer effect on Trevor Lawrence and how he survived that. Well, Adam Fantilli didn't even have to walk through the fire that was a Mike Babcock coaching career, because you knew, much like when Madonna was ready for his 1500th game and he got scratched, Fantilli would have his 49th goal in the last game of the season. He'd scratch him too. Yeah.
Absolutely. That was definitely going to happen. So there is that. I think that wraps up the entire offseason recap for us.
Yeah.
I think we did it in even less time than I expected. So great job for us, Rick. So real quick here, what we're going to do, we are going to just briefly go over the divisions really fast. Yep. And we are just going to list, I think we could keep it simple, Rick, the team that we expect to win this division come the end of the season. So we started in the Eastern Conference. We were talking about the Columbus Blue Jackets there in the Metropolitan Division. Rick, your preseason Metropolitan Division winner.
I think it comes down to two teams. I think Pittsburgh could surprise you because of that one last run, but I think it comes down to Carolina or New Jersey. I think that Carolina did a lot more in the offseason, and so I give them the slight edge, but it wouldn't surprise me if the Devils are the winners because they're just a young, hungry, gritty team, very good players. Jack Hughes, Timo Heyer, excellent players. And you know what? They have a kid in training camp who, if he gets a chance to start, it's Jeremy Brodeur. Remember last time Brodeur played goalie for the Devils? I think I do too. Yeah, but I think Carolina's a really good team. I think they have the best chance of winning this division, I think.
Right, I'm with you there. I think Carolina, they're, forget even just winning the division, I think Carolina Hurricanes are going to be, to some people, a popular President's Trophy pick because I think Carolina very much would want and value the idea of home ice throughout the majority of the playoffs or themselves. So I think that's going to be a big thing to watch out for. But I'm with you. I think New Jersey shocked a lot of people last season. I don't think there's going to be shocking people this time around. I think the New Jersey Devils are the definitive second team to say the least in the Metro Division. Sorry, New York. Actually, not that. Sorry.
No.
The Atlantic Division, Rick, I will go first on this one. I think because the Tampa Bay Lightning, let's bring this up right now because I think it's towards the end here where we can mention it. Andrei Vasilevsky, the news broke today that he had to get back surgery and he's going to be out projected 8 to 10 weeks. Very tricky thing when it comes to back surgery of all things. I would be even willing to bet that it might be an extra 2 to 3 weeks on the long-term prognosis there. I'm not saying this because I'm a doctor. I'm saying this because if I'm Tampa Bay, that's the guy that's the backbone of the dang team. Yep. And you don't want him to come back early. I don't care if Vasilevsky says after 7 weeks he feels good. He's waiting until they know for sure that he's fine. So they have that blow to them. The Boston Bruins suffered a lot of roster turnover, Rick. I think this is the Toronto Maple Leafs division to lose here. I'm going to say they're going to win the Atlantic for myself personally.
It truly does make the most sense for them to be in that spot here. I think they're going to be the favorites that are going in here. I'm going to go with an outside the box pick though, because I tend to be a little surprising with some of my selections in the football world here. But I don't think they're going to get a lot of play, but I'm going to stick my neck out here for Buffalo. I think the Sabres are a young, hungry team. I think Tage Thompson's excellent. And I think, they have a Rasmus Dahlin, who's a really, really good defenseman. I think the Sabres can surprise a lot of people. They're a very good young team. I think that Don Granato's got a really good squad up there. And if they go out to an early enough edge on some of these teams and everyone else is playing catch up, I think they have enough depth to do it. They could be buyers come deadline time if they're really serious about, being good. So I think Buffalo could be a surprise in this division here. I think Toronto's a very good, safe pick, but let's have some fun. Go with the Sabres.
I don't blame you because I think talent-wise, Buffalo has made significant strides. We talked about some of the teams in this division that want to make that leap. I think, personally speaking, the Buffalo Sabres believe that the leap is now that they are going to make the playoffs this season. And I don't like when you have a defensive core that has Rasmus Dahlin and Owen Power on it, and you have Tage Thompson being the leader of that forward core. Woof, Maron, that is a lot of talent. My only thing that kind of makes me take a step back from considering them to be that high is just the goaltending. I think Eric Comrie is he's fine, but we know he's just a lame duck at this point because Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, he was the future for a little bit, but now thank you. But now it looks to be Devin Levi who could be the future in net for the Buffalo Sabres. But that being said, do not want to discount them because we were talking about Ottawa and Detroit wanting to make those playoff pushes. I think this could finally be the year of the Buffalo Sabres playoff push.
Yeah, I mean, I think Luukkonen and Levi could be your next swing, really.
Oh yeah, the two of them could be pretty good together. So myself, it's the Leafs winning it. For Rick, it's the Sabres. I'll save this division for we could kind of talk about them together because both our teams are in it. The Central and the Pacific Division, Rick, are two very interesting divisions to say the very least. I think when it comes to the regular season, I think even though there are questions about this team, but I believe that there's just something that's going to drive them finally this season. I think the Edmonton Oilers win the Pacific this year, and I think they really want to have home ice throughout at least the first two rounds. I know it didn't go to a Game 7 against the Vegas Golden Knights, but I think Edmonton would like to have the security of that in their back pocket. And Lord knows what McDavid and Draisaitl are going to do again this season. So there's that. I think the Central Division, to me, Rick, this might be the toughest division to predict of all four, at least for myself personally, because I could see myself going in a lot of different ways. I'm going to say the Dallas Stars are going to actually win the Central Division this year. I think you have the best individual goalie in the division. I mean, there's a lot of good goaltending. Do not get me wrong on that. But I think Jake Ottinger is the best goalie in the division by maybe a hair against the likes of Saros and Hellebuck. I think a very underrated defenseman, I think, in certain circles, Miro Heiskanen, supremely talented young man there. And then, like I said, I mentioned they added Matt Duchene the offseason. They were very quiet this offseason. They didn't do anything crazy or special, but I think Dallas has a good team. They made it to the conference finals already last year, and I think they believe that this could be, another good year for them. So they're going to be my preseason pick to win the Central Division in the regular season, to say the least. So
we're in lockstep. I think Edmonton wins the Pacific and takes the President's Trophy. Honestly, I think they're going to be a really hot offensive team and a really tough team to stop. I think they're going to be a lot of fun to watch too, and I think Dallas. I think Dallas will win the Central on the very last day because it's going to come down to them in Colorado. But I think they're going to go ahead because I feel like while Colorado's got a lot of young players that are really good, they've also got a lot of injury history with some of their top guys. And, you never want that to rear its ugly head again, but it happens. Sometimes when the injury bug bites you once, it's going to bite you 2 or 3 more times before, your career's over with. So
yeah,
I think that's it. I think Dallas is going to win that Central Division pretty handily.
Yeah, I don't blame you. Colorado is actually already the walking wounded because we know Gabriel Landeskog is confirmed to miss the entirety of this next season. And they got so much bad injury luck last season. It was making some people question them. But, McKinnon, he was good. Rantanen, when he came back, and Cale Makar as well suffered injury. The crazy thing is all their top guys suffered injuries. They still finished second in the division, which I think was crazy. They just happened to run into Seattle. Actually, no, wait. Did Colorado win the division last year?
Yeah, I believe they did. Yeah.
Yes, because Seattle's in the Pacific, so they won the division last year. We're one of the top 4 seeds in the league, and then the Seattle Kraken just come in out of nowhere, they say, and just did their thing. Just what a time it was! But
what time?
Yeah, I think it will certainly be interesting, and there's definitely plenty of more questions we could ask about this. That will probably come back up. More hockey talk will be had on the show. Probably a good amount of it here and there will probably be just me. But hey, if there's ever a need for this, ladies and gentlemen, you already know the 2 people you're going to hear from on this. Rick, thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
We've had some fun, and looking forward to doing it again sometime in better weather with lot less Mike Babcock references, actually. We'll do that. Yeah.
Most definitely. And of course, as I mentioned already, the podcast that Rick and I do on a weekly basis for ourselves, it is called the Sports Agents of Chaos. We go live on Saturdays throughout the season. off-season as well. But, during the NFL regular season, there's going to be plenty of chaos that happens on that show, hence the name. And we talk all football on that show. So kind of similar to what we've done the last 2.5, 3 weeks on the Somewhat Sports Podcast, aside from, a certain player that got traded around the time of recording of this program. And yeah, you could also follow him if you so choose at Podfather Judas on Twitter. Complete inside joke based on the podcast we do. So if you want those inside jokes, watch the show. But speaking of shows, ladies and gentlemen, it is the end of this program here. From myself, from Rick, who's so amazing that he was able to join me on this, and from my two compatriots, Chris and Dame, who are unable to be alongside this week. Thank you all so much for joining us on this week's edition of the Somewhat Sports Podcast. Please continue to listen to the show on YouTube, Somewhat Spaced in Sports on YouTube and Spotify. Like, comment, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Give us 5 stars, a like, and a review. Please let us know. We love to hear feedback from people on what we want to talk, what the people want to hear. Do you want more isolated episodes like this where we're just literally focusing on one sport the whole time? I mean, that kind of sometimes happens on the show itself, but this was a fun episode to say the very least, and we could definitely do more of it. And also for updates on when this episode and many more like it will get posted, it is at somewhat.sports on Instagram. I don't know when this is going to be posted, but probably somewhere around this. It'll either be after an NFL weekend or just before a new NFL week of games will be happening. So if that is the case, you'll see the next set of predictions from myself, Chris, and Dane. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us on yet another edition of the Somewhat Sports Podcast, and we will see you guys next time.